This is a production of the Defense Intelligence Agency document STC S01166972, titled Controlled Offensive Behavior, USSR. Published in July 1972, this document was prepared by the United States Army Office of the Surgeon General, Medical Intelligence Office, and written by Captain John D. Lamoth of the Medical Service Corps. This document was declassified and approved for release in 2003. Preface. This report summarizes the information available on Soviet research on human vulnerability as it relates to incapacitating individuals or small groups. The information contained in this study is a review and evaluation of Soviet research in the field of revolutionary methods of influencing human behavior, and is intended as an aid in the development of countermeasures for the protection of U.S. or Allied personnel. Due to the nature of the Soviet research in the area of reorientation or incapacitation of human behavior, this report emphasizes the individual as opposed to groups. It is not within the realm of this report to make an in-depth study of research and utilization of the multitudinous aspects of psychology and psychiatry. It is strongly suggested that these subjects and the military use thereof should be established as separate studies. The importance of basic and applied research in these areas should not be overlooked. The information reported covers the period from 1874 to 1972 and has been drawn from scientific, medical, and military journals, intelligence reports, magazines, news items, books, conferences, and other reports as referenced. The information cutoff date for this report was 31st January 1972. Summary. Controlled offensive behavior, as defined within the scope of this report, includes Soviet research on human vulnerability as it applies to methods of influencing or altering human behavior. There is an ever-increasing amount of information emanating from the USSR that suggests that certain authoritarian institutions in the USSR are engaged in the practice of mental reorientation of numerous individuals who are classed as political dissenters. The mental reorientation is being accomplished through various means, including confinement, isolation, and psychopharmaceutical administration. This treatment of so-called insane individuals is causing alarm among an international cross-section of psychiatrists. The literature contains sufficient data on human mental manipulation and therefore warrants surveillance by interested parties. It appears that the USSR stresses physical and medical treatment of its political detainees under the guise of psychiatric care rehabilitation. The Soviet Union is well aware of the benefits and applications of parapsychology research. The term parapsychology denotes a multidisciplinary field consisting of the sciences of bionics, biophysics, psychophysics, psychology, physiology, and neuropsychiatry. Many scientists, US and Soviet, feel that parapsychology can be harnessed to create conditions where one can alter or manipulate the minds of others. The major impetus behind the Soviet drive to harness the possible capabilities of telepathic communication, telekinetics, and bionics are said to come from the Soviet military and the KGB. Today, it is reported that the USSR has 20 or more centers for the study of parapsychological phenomena, with an annual budget estimated at $21 million. Parapsychological research in the USSR began in the 1920s and has continued to the present. Based on their head start and financial support, it could be concluded that Soviet knowledge in this field is superior to that of the U.S. Methods for controlling behavior of the human being are numerous. Not all of the possibilities were included in this report, but an attempt was made to elaborate on those areas where there is intensive research by the USSR. The use of sound, light, and color or odors have been determined to be possible means for Soviet exploitation in order to alter human behavior. In the area of color and lights, usually in a flickering mode, there have been reports of actual trials by the Soviets on US or Allied personnel. The Soviets have shown an in-depth knowledge in the effects of sound and light on biological systems. it appears that with their knowledge, it would be a rather simple procedure to make the transformation from scientific research to the applications phase. The area of pheromone research has interested the Soviets. However, their data is sketchy, and it is conceivable that they are not yet aware of the tremendous potentials that these substances provide for causing human behavioral changes. It is also a possibility that the USSR has realized the military benefits and are not publishing or conversing about their research and development efforts concerning pheromone synthesis and uses. Part 1. Introduction to Human Behavior Manipulation. Section 1. Background. Methods for manipulating or influencing the human mind exist and are being thoroughly researched by members of the Soviet scientific community. For background and introductory information, it would be best if some of these methods were briefly mentioned. Techniques studied by the Soviets include biochemicals, sound, light, color, odors, sensory deprivation, sleep, electronic and magnetic fields, hypnosis, autosuggestion, and paranormal phenomena such as psychokinesis, extrasensory perception, astral projection, dream state, clairvoyance, and precognition. Paranormal phenomena have caused great excitement in recent years in the Soviet Union. So much so that it has been reported that the Soviets had 20 or more centers in 1967 for the study of this area. It was also reported that the annual budget for 1967 for paranormal research was approximately $20 million. The purpose of mind-altering techniques is to create one or more of several different possible states in the conscious or unconscious area of the brain. The ultimate goal of controlled offensive behavior might well be the total submission of one's will to some outside force. It is more realistic to assume that lesser degrees of mental aberration would be the purpose of Soviet research in this field. Some areas of human mind manipulation that apply to this report are morale lowering, confusion, anxiety, loss of confidence, loss of self-reliance, fatigue, persuasion, disruption of social cohesion, or complete incapacitation. Since the desired end product of this type of research is some change in the human mind, only the non-lethal aspects are discussed in this report. It should be remembered, however, that some techniques have lethal thresholds. The purpose of this study is to portray the Soviet research in mind manipulation and its possible use on US or Allied individuals or troops. Controlled offensive behavior, however, has other connotations. Certain methods of altering mental or physical states of man may have application on one's own individuals. The apport technique and astral projection are examples which will be discussed in this report. These two methods allow the enemy to impart certain behavioral characteristics on its own people to the detriment of US or Allied personnel or missions. Section 2. Current Events. Part A. Events in Northern Ireland. The following discussion is based on 1971 and 1972 literature dealing with the manipulation of human behavior. The events that have been reported to have occurred are not Soviet-originated, but provide an excellent example of the type of efforts that this report is expressing. Recently, there has appeared in the press some discussion elaborating on the techniques and procedures for detaining, treating, and interrogating prisoners in Northern Ireland. According to the report, once the detainees are in prison, they come under three types of regime, which create in men a state of great confusion, suggestibility, and distress. The first regime contained various methods to produce sensory isolation. The men were made to stand still against a wall with their hands in the air for 4 to 6 hours at a time. The total length was 43.5 hours. Hoods were placed over the men's heads to further abolish visual input. Sensory input was further decreased by having loud noise generators turned on in order to mask meaningful sounds. The detainees were therefore isolated from their sensory world. The second sensory regime has the effect of increasing confusion and disorientation. Some men were rushed out, hooded and doubled up, past barking dogs, loaded into a helicopter, doors closed, engine revved up, then unloaded, then reloaded, with the procedure repeated 3 times. In another incident, detainees without shoes were made to move quickly over rough ground by military police. The third type of treatment has the effect of increasing stress and anxiety and reducing resistance to the disorienting effect on the 2 types described above. It appears that dietary intake was restricted to bread and water at 6-hour intervals. Maximum weight loss was achieved, it appears. One detainee lost 8 pounds in 7 days. To accompany the diet restrictions, no sleep was allowed the first 2 or 3 days. 48 hours sleep deprivation in certain individuals has been known to precipitate psychotic-like states. Psychological torture and physical abuse has been used on Catholic detainees in Northern Ireland. High-frequency sound waves and sensory deprivation methods that have been outlawed for use on humans by the American Psychological Association were being used to undermine the dignity and destroy the effectiveness of the Catholic minority of Northern Ireland. The case of one 40-year-old released prisoner has been reported. Upon release, the man's mental and physical condition suggested senility, a condition inconsistent with his health at the time of his internment. The man walks like he is 65, whimpers in the dark, and has an attention span so short he cannot carry on a conversation. The Northern Ireland procedure can be expected to greatly increase the pliability of detainees under interrogation, since sensory deprivation increases suggestibility and lowers intellectual competence. Stress isolation techniques can reach the extent of eliciting false confessions, where both prisoner and interrogator are convinced the statements rendered are true. It is hoped that the above examples impart to the reader a feeling for the type of mind manipulating procedures that will be discussed later in this report. Since it appears that the research behind sensory deprivation has been put to current use on humans, the interested reader might peruse Biderman and Zimmer's 1961 publication entitled The Manipulation of Human Behavior. The book represents a critical examination of some of the conjectures about the application of scientific knowledge to manipulation of human behavior. The problem is explored within a particular frame of reference, the interrogation of an unwilling subject. Attention has been focused on interrogation because of the central position this topic has had in public discussions of prisoner of war behavior. Part B. Events in the Soviet Union. The use of psychiatric detention to silence political dissenters appears to be a method being utilized by the Soviet Union. There is extensive documentation from samizdat sources in the Soviet Union, notably A Question of Madness by Soviet geneticist Joris Medvedev. British Sovietologist Peter Reddaway asserts that the number of such political detainees in the USSR has grown sharply in the last 2 years, perhaps to several hundred. On the surface, the fact that the Soviet Union has been subjecting political dissenters to psychiatric institutions may not appear relevant to this report. However, as one probes into this area, he discovers that the medical and physical treatment of these prisoners borders on the subject of controlled offensive behavior. Since the techniques are reportedly being applied to Soviet citizens, it is simple enough, as the researchers gain knowledge and expertise in this area, to assume that alien personnel could someday be subjected to it as well. From the many reports, some coming from the Soviet Union underground press, the article that best relates some of the medical and physical treatment to political detainees is discussed below. The article was written about Vladimir Bukovsky, who is frequently quoted in the feature story. Bukovsky has spent 6 of his 27 years in Soviet prisons, asylums, and labor camps. In May 1963, Bukovsky was arrested by the KGB. He was declared insane by the Serbsky Psychiatric Institute. That December, he was transferred to a prison asylum in Leningrad, where he spent, in his own words, 15 months of hell. There were about 1,000 men in the asylum, political prisoners and insane murderers, says Bukovsky. The sick raved, the healthy suffered. Doctors were technically in charge of the inmates, but the real masters were brutal turnkeys and prisoner trustees. Only the crafty survived. You had to be nice to the guards. You had to bribe them. Otherwise, they can beat you until you are nearly dead and tell the doctors you misbehaved. Or they could recommend medical punishment. The worst, according to Bukovsky, was medical punishment. The 3 methods of medical punishment known to Bukovsky are described as follows. First, on the recommendation of a trustee or turnkey, doctors would inject a drug that produced severe stomach cramps, fever, intense pain, and a temperature of 104. The sickness lasted 2 or 3 days and left the inmate very weak. Second, another drug reserved for serious misbehavior induced sleep and dulled the brain. Inmates were punished with 10 days of daily injections. They woke up as human vegetables. Some regained their senses after 2 months, others did not. Third, the third punishment was the canvas bandage. An inmate would be tightly swathed in wet canvas from neck to toes, while others in his ward were forced to watch. The canvas shrinks as it dries. It is not a pretty sight. They usually only do it for 2 or 3 hours. A nurse is always in attendance, and the bandages are loosened when the pulse grows weak. A 1,000-word telegram by Andrei D. Sakharov to Colonel Nikolai A. Shelukov, Minister of the Interior, relates further information on the use of drugs to alter mental behavior. Sakharov, a physicist and civil rights champion, charged that a violation of human rights and medical ethics is occurring in the Soviet Union. The contention is that drugs are being administered forcibly to inmates in an effort to have them change their political beliefs. In addition, some prisoners are threatened with the possible use of electrical shock therapy. According to Sakharov, medicine, one of the most humane of the professions, is thus being turned into a servile handmaiden of the regime's correction agencies. It is further reported that with the help of medicine, an attempt is being made to make people literally lose their minds by chemical and physical means if they refuse to adapt their mind to the standards of the regime. One of the few references that mention a drug by name is a London Times feature by Richard Preston. In several cases, Soviet authorities forced political prisoners to submit to the use of mind-bending drugs, specifically aminazine and haloperidol. Aminazine is the Soviet brand of a phenothiazine derivative known as chlorpromazine. Haloperidol is a butyrolphenol. Both drugs are in the tranquilizer class of therapeutic agents. Information on the plight of political prisoners in mental wards and other examples of internal Soviet repression is contained in issue 18 of A Chronicle of Current Events. The Chronicle has just passed its 3rd anniversary, despite the increasing efforts of the KGB to shut down this underground publication. The last issue discusses the case of Vasily the Fuhrer Chernyshov, who was arrested in March of 1970. The Chronicle quotes Chernyshov, "I am terribly afraid of torture, but there is an even worse torture, meddling with my brain with chemical substances. I have now been informed of the decision that I shall be given treatment. Farewell." Chernyshov's compulsory treatment was prescribed after only a 5-minute interview with the authorities. The concluding statement from the panel of doctors was, "The main thing for us is that you shouldn't think at all." A document that contains several case histories of political detainees has been prepared by Abraham Brumberg. The article summarizes the procedure that is used in the Soviet Union from arrest to confession. According to the report, the KGB performs the search, arrest, and initial investigation. The medical experts cooperate in furnishing bogus diagnoses, and the court confirms the findings of the doctors. The victim is then sent off to a prison asylum to languish until cured, which in most cases consists of the patient's confession that he is indeed guilty of some form of mental aberration. The legal procedures involved in detaining an undesirable have been drastically reduced by the 1961 directives. V.N. Chalidze, in an underground document, explains how the 1961 directives allow for the immediate detention of a sane individual who is not a criminal in the legal sense. Chalidze sums up his argument by noting that the viciousness of the present-day practice, not based on the law, of psychiatric preventive measures is due to the absence of any public means of defense for the patient. The possible use of drugs by Soviet psychiatrists in order to manipulate behavior can be emphasized by an account from Vladimir Gershuny, a Soviet idealist. The event that follows occurred at the Oriel Hospital, which is some 170 miles southwest of Moscow. Mr. Gershuny gives a description of the conditions in which mental patients, both genuine and political, are held. 8 people to a 16 or 17 meter cell. There is no room to move. The toilet is a cesspit, 4 holes in the ground and 2 taps for 54 people. Mr. Gershuny talks about the use of drugs, one of which is aminazine, a powerful substance administered orally or by intramuscular injections, which causes depressive shock reactions and frequently malignant tumors. Sometimes drugs are given as a form of punishment. Any phrase spoken incautiously to a doctor or nurse can serve as a pretext for a series of aminazine injections. Sometimes these injections are prescribed without any pretext, simply because of some doctor's whim, without any medical examination. This medicine makes me feel more horrible than anything I've ever experienced before. You no sooner lie down than you want to get up. You no sooner take a step than you're longing to sit down. And if you sit down, you want to walk again, and there's nowhere to walk. Mr. Gershuny finishes his account by describing the fate of a young man, once brilliantly alive and alert, who as a result of repeated doses of aminazine, and God only knows what else, had been reduced to a vegetable. His head on one side, his speech languid and indistinct, his eyes glazed. He was thus, concludes Mr. Gershuny, cancelled out for 5 whole months. Hail to Soviet special psychiatry. To belabor this subject of political detention is not the intention of this section. However, it is believed to be of sufficient importance that this much material had to be presented. It is difficult to judge the overall validity of much of the reference material because of its source, but if true, it bears watching and possible investigation for future developments. Portions of this material contain sufficient data on human mental manipulation and therefore warrant surveillance by interested agencies. From the information available at this time, it appears that the Soviet Union stresses physical and medical treatment of its political detainees under the guise of psychiatric care rehabilitation. No data is available on the use of sound, lights, or hypnosis as methods of obtaining confessions or reorientating the beliefs of these prisoners. Part C. Soviet response to events in the USSR. The Soviet government, quite naturally, has denied the charges made in the USSR and abroad that mentally stable persons were being detained in psychiatric hospitals because of dissident activities. The Soviet authorities had said little about the accusations until an article written by S.P. Pisarev was obtained by Western sources from the Soviet underground. Pisarev, 69, a member of the Soviet Communist Party since 1918 and a minor party official in 1970, directed a letter to the Soviet Academy of Medical Sciences protesting the Soviet police practice of sending political prisoners to psychiatric institutions, such as the infamous Serbsky Institute in Moscow. Disputing the type of charge mentioned by Pisarev, Soviet authorities contended persons remanded by a legal psychiatric commission to special mental institutions were those who committed socially dangerous acts while not responsible for their actions, or became ill during a pretrial investigation, during actual court proceedings, or after the passing of sentence. According to the Soviet government, such cases are reviewed every 6 months and committed persons are released if sufficient improvement is found in their mental health. A.V. Snezhnevsky, USSR Academy of Medical Sciences, academician and director of the USSR Academy of Medical Sciences Psychiatric Institute, says, "Yes, I too have read these absurd reports that in the USSR healthy people are put into psychiatric hospitals. Like all my colleagues, I cannot express my feelings of profound indignation at this wild fantasy. Soviet psychiatrists do not, of course, need to be defended from insulting attacks of this sort." Snezhnevsky continues his argument by listing the members of a U.S. mission that toured Soviet psychiatric facilities. The mission says in its conclusion, "It appears that the Soviets are leading." The U.S. guests stressed the high degree of effectiveness of the Soviet psychiatric first aid centers and the better quality of their staffs compared with U.S. centers. The U.S. delegation did visit the Serbsky Institute. As for compulsory treatment, the mission stated, "It is possible that people who need treatment should be compulsorily hospitalized for their own good." Snezhnevsky, in another document, said that when mentioning brainwashing, many absurd allegations have been made, such as the talk of injecting a substance which paralyzes a person's will. Snezhnevsky contends that brainwashing, from a scientific point of view, is absurd. He further believes that the people dedicated to this sort of propaganda have very few scruples and direct the propaganda to laymen who know nothing about medicine. The literature from Soviet authorities denying the maltreatment of detainees or other charges does not mention any of the more celebrated prisoners, with the exception of Zhoris Medvedev, who was released after a very short stay. One can draw some obvious conjectures based on the avoidance of such personalities as Gershuni, Grigorenko, Bukovsky, Feinberg, and Borisov in the Soviet statements. The issue of inhumane treatment is usually responded to with the use of platitudes and counter-propaganda. If the Soviets have nothing to conceal, then it would seem that one could expect more scientific and concrete responses as to the actual situation in political detention and behavior manipulation with drugs. Section 3, Soviet Psychology and Psychiatry, Part A, a general review. The past 15 years have witnessed a definite acceleration of growth in Soviet psychology. It has been observed by some American psychologists that an upward trend in the quality and quantity of Soviet published research began around the middle of the 1950s. Research designs improved, greater experimental controls were employed, and the level of sophistication in laboratory techniques started to rise perceptibly. Many new people are entering into the area of psychology, and the increase has been as much as a factor of 2, 3, or 4. Soviet psychology is in a growth stage which appears to have sprung up coincident to the Man in Space program. It is believed that despite the growth and acceptance by the Soviet scientific community, the Soviets are merely duplicating or extending to some degree the research that is already known. In the opinion of this source, there is definitely a tie-in between the Soviet engineers, psychiatrists, and psychologists. It must be remembered that the Soviets are presently in a growth stage and therefore are merely making their investments at this time. According to this source, once they have reached the level-off period, then this coordination of the disciplines will pay off handsomely in returns to the Soviet Psychological Society. In the area of human engineering, the Soviets are moving very rapidly and, at least in many respects, are close to US levels. In behavior studies, the Soviets are stagnant. They lean too heavily on the conditional response approach of Pavlov. In the neurosensory areas, the source believes that the Soviets are considerably behind the US and accept the US as the leader in this field. According to one report, there is apparently classified psychological research work going on in the area of cybernetics. One area that surveillance would appear fruitful is Soviet research in the area of artificial intelligence. It is concluded that in spite of their ideological resistance to theoretical psychology, Soviet behavior scientists share a distinguished experimental tradition and possess the ability to incorporate and combine the principles of biocybernetics, physiology, learning, memory, and transfer under a common group of laws. The following brief discussion of Soviet psychiatry is based primarily upon a report by Persic. The report contains a brief history of psychiatry in the Soviet Union, followed by a section that relates to the scientific and investigative work in psychiatry. Also included is a section on the organization of psychiatric care, including statistics on the number of patients, beds, and medical personnel in the Soviet Union. According to Persic, there are 94 medical institutes and a greater number of medical research institutes. The following research institutes in psychiatry exist in Moscow: the Psychiatric Institute at the Academy of Science, the Psychiatric Institute at the Ministry of Health for the Russian Federation, and the Institute for Forensic Psychiatry at the Institute of the Ministry of Health of the USSR, also known as the Serbsky Institute. The research institutes are either of a general type or of a specialized type, which study certain mental diseases, e.g. schizophrenia, epilepsy, or alcoholism. The psychiatric research institutes have similar organizational schemes: clinical departments, laboratories, and methodics departments. The Psychiatric Institute of the Academy of Sciences in Moscow is the postgraduate school for psychiatrists. At the Institute for Forensic Psychiatry in Moscow are clinics for schizophrenia, psychoorganic disorders, and alcoholism. The task of psychiatric institutes is to deal with the educational matters of students and physicians specializing in psychiatry. This work is conducted in the form of seminars and in the form of continuous education. The psychiatric research institutes are connected with psychiatric hospitals, departments, and dispensaries in advancing psychiatric work and the organizing of psychiatric service. Great attention is devoted to health education in the USSR. A great network of institutions devoted to health instruction exist. Included in the general health education is also education concerning mental health. There are 360 health institutes in the USSR, which are devoted to teaching health. The Central Institute for Health Education in Moscow is engaged in research in the field of health education, education of experts, training in the methodology of health education, and organizing health training. The number and quality of both psychology and psychiatry research reports is increasing, especially in the behavioral fields. There appears to be an ever-increasing link between the psychology and psychiatry fields, with the pharmacology, human engineering, bioelectronics, physics, and parapsychology disciplines. Some of the multidiscipline aspects of Soviet research will become evident later in this study as it relates to the subject of this report. The above information on psychology and psychiatry was intended to be a review because it is believed that there is a definite relationship between the two disciplines and mental manipulation. It is not within the scope of this report to delve into basic psychological research and discuss its military implications. Part B, Soviet Military Psychology. The purpose of this report is to make determinations and report findings on methods of controlling human behavior. One aspect of this subject is the possible use of certain novel techniques to disrupt or confuse combat troops. Based on Soviet literature dealing with military psychology, it appears that the Soviet military authorities might well suspect their potential enemies as already being able to do this. The available Soviet literature on military psychology emphasizes the protection of their troops against such possible attempts, e.g., demoralization and confusion. In 1967, a book entitled Military Psychology was published in the Soviet Union. The authors, Colonel Dyachenko and Major Fedenko, are candidates of pedagogical sciences. This book is primarily intended for commanders and military doctors. The book deals with the various aspects of the personality of the soldier, including his cognitive, emotional, and volitional processes, his fighting skill, and his psychological readiness for battle. All of the psychic phenomena are based on the service, training, and fighting activity of enlisted and commissioned personnel. One of the more interesting areas is found in Chapter 8, which is entitled Willpower. The chapter contains information on willpower as a psychic process. The chapter continues by discussing the qualities of willpower necessary to a soldier, as well as methods of training willpower. The discussion on willpower appears to be a very important topic, because if one's willpower is sufficiently developed, the use of techniques to demoralize or confuse could well be nullified. The group of people most susceptible to offensive behavior manipulation appear to be rear zone troops and small patrol groups. The Soviets again seem to recognize the fallibility of such groups. Lieutenant General Tyunev reports that the moral psychological training of administrative support troops in operations under conditions of modern war is a quite urgent and complicated problem. The report suggests training and propaganda methods to increase the morale psychological condition of rear zone troops. The training, to include evening seminars, propaganda sessions, political indoctrination, and field exercises, is suggested in Tyunev's report. Two further reports from the Soviets have appeared recently. One report discusses the role of medicine and military medical personnel in the psychoprophylaxis in morale psychological preparation. A 1970 report by Stolyarenko reinforces the thoughts of Tyunev. From the above discussion and a thorough perusal of the documents referenced in this section, it could be stated, if the Soviets practice what they preach, the psychological training of Soviet troops is as good as or better than U.S. soldiers. This does not include the special training afforded to U.S. pilots on anti-interrogation methods. Section 4. Psychological phenomena and psychological weapons. One of the purposes of this report is to evaluate research in the field of influencing human behavior in order that the U.S. may be in a position to develop certain countermeasures. Therefore, before beginning specific sections in this report on Soviet research, it is desirable to review some of the more feasible areas of exploitation in the development of a technique that might alter human behavior. Some of these characteristics will be studied in depth in later sections of this study. Part A. Temperature. An increase in body temperature decreases the body water level and creates a salt-water imbalance. With a large intake of water, but little replacement of sodium chloride, painful spasms of the skeletal and abdominal muscles may develop, as may also faintness, weakness, nausea, and vomiting. With an internal temperature above 41 degrees Celsius or below 31 degrees Celsius, brain function is usually impaired. Irreversible damage to the skin occurs at about 44 to 45 degrees Celsius. The sensitivity and tolerance for temperature changes is different for certain races. Negroes have a greater tolerance for humid heat than Caucasians, and conversely, Negroes are more susceptible to injury from cold stress than Caucasians. It is believed that the use of temperature manipulation as a technique to influence human behavior is practical. In order to be effective, it would seem necessary to apply this technique to individuals or small groups that are already under one's influence, such as prisoners of war. The application of unnatural temperature in field situations appear to be most difficult. Further, there appears to be very little applicable research in the USSR in this area, other than some isolated work in the aerospace field. It may be concluded that temperature fluctuations could be used for altering human behavior, but would probably not be as useful as other available methods. Part B. Atmospheric conditions. There has been some work reported on the physiological or psychological effects of atmospheric or geophysical parameters. The works referenced here are free world, but there is little doubt that the Soviet Union has investigated similar effects, especially in relation to their space program. The utilization of any of the techniques to alter human behavior by changing atmospheric conditions seems remote for field application. These techniques, like temperature effects, are more suitable for controlled groups or individuals. An increase of 0.2% carbon dioxide doubles the volume of air breathed. Breathing becomes deeper, more rapid, and eventually violent. Depletion of oxygen or the increase of carbon dioxide decreases auditory sensitivity as well as visual sensitivity. 10% of oxygen for 15 to 30 minutes sometimes results in a hearing deficit for several hours. With severe or prolonged anoxia, there may be nausea, vomiting, extreme weakness, and eventually convulsions and cardiac failure. Perhaps the applicable symptoms of anoxia to this report are the homeostatic imbalances in the brain, loss of ability to carry on complex activities, restlessness, loquacity, delirium, confusion, and unconsciousness. Intermittent exposures to negatively ionized air produces a sedating effect on humans. There are some researchers who believe that positively ionized air causes irritation and anxiety, which is applicable to altering behavior. Part C, olfactory phenomena. 7 primary odors have been identified. They are camphoraceous, musky, floral, minty, pungent, putrid, and ethereal. From the 7 primary odors, every known odor can be made by mixing them in certain proportions. Man expresses pleasure or displeasure to various odors. If the smell is foul or irritating enough, man will attempt to avoid it. If escape is hindered, or if odors are used with surprise, they may elicit certain behavioral changes in the individual. Odors are suitable for use in controlled situations and in the field. For these reasons, odors will be discussed more fully later in this report. Part D, light. Although it is customary to specify the wavelength range of visible light as lying between 400 and 750 millimicrons, nevertheless, with sufficient energy, the eye can be stimulated up to 1050 millimicrons. Also, the fovea can be stimulated down to about 320 millimicrons. It is thought that 1150 to 1200 millimicrons marks the limit at which radiant energy would cease to be seen and would be readily felt as heat. Yellow light has maximum effect on the retina and is most effective in eliciting photophobia. Non-rhythmic bright lights can interrupt or prevent sleep. It has been claimed that if sensory stimulation is sufficient, sleep can be prevented even if fatigue is carried to the point of death. The physiological and psychological effects of flashing lights and photic flicker appear to have raised interests in the Soviet Union. Since lights can be utilized in the field or in controlled situations and do cause certain behavioral changes in man, this subject will be discussed in detail later in this report. Part E, sound. Sound from one source or another has been used to elicit behavioral changes in man in every war ever recorded. It may be a simple bugle call or battle cry or a mechanical siren device. But whatever is used, there is normally a psychological response by the receiver. Regardless of the absolute level, sounds of enemy weapons with which one is unfamiliar is frightening, provided the sounds are associated with a feared weapon or the unknown. Auditory effects have been and still are researched. Nerve deafness can certainly result from prolonged exposure to loud sounds. For the purpose of this study, it is believed that the non-auditory effects are just as important when discussing behavioral alterations. For example, exposure to a siren-generated sound of 20 kilohertz at 1 watt per square centimeter kills a variety of insect life in 3 to 4 minutes, and larger animals, mice, in about 1 minute. Human operators with earplugs experience cool, sizzling sensations in the mouth and an unpleasant tingling in the nasal passages when near the siren. Sound can be used on controlled groups or in the field. Sound can produce behavioral changes, and the effects of sound on humans is being investigated in the Soviet Union. For these reasons, a more detailed discussion can be found later in this report. Part F, electromagnetic energy. Super high frequency. Electromagnetic oscillations, or SHF, may have potential use as a technique for altering human behavior. Soviet Union and other foreign literature sources contain over 500 studies devoted to the biological effect of SHF. Lethal and non-lethal aspects have been shown to exist. In certain non-lethal exposures, definite behavioral changes have occurred. There also appears to be a change in mammals when exposed to SHF in the sensitivity to sound, light, and olfactory stimuli. Because of the possible behavioral changes and reactions to other important stimuli, and the emphasis the Soviet Union has placed on SHF research, a more detailed discussion of this subject appears later in this report. Part G, deprivation. The behavior effects on man from the deprivation of food, sleep, and sensory stimuli have been studied by the Soviet Union. As mentioned in Section 2 of this report, certain forms of deprivation to humans, is in current use. This area is very important in the discussion of controlled offensive behavior, and it is clear that the Soviet Union is well aware of this potential. Because one is able to apply deprivation techniques in controlled situations as well as in the field, it will be discussed in detail in a later section of this report. Segment break music. Narrator. You are listening to an audiobook production of the Declassified Defense Intelligence Agency document, Controlled Offensive Behavior, USSR. Music fades out. Part 2. Parapsychology in the Soviet Union. Section 1. Background. The science of parapsychology includes special sensory biophysical activities, brain and mind control, telepathic communications or bioinformation transceiving, bioluminescent and bioenergetic emissions, and the effects of altered status of consciousness on the human psyche. The Soviets prefer the term biocommunications instead of the term parapsychology. Other terms that may appear in the Soviet literature that normally mean parapsychology are psychophysiology, psychotronics, psychoenergetics, or biophysical effects. The term parapsychology, as used in this report, denotes a multidisciplinary field consisting of the sciences of bionics, biophysics, psychophysics, psychology, physiology, and neuropsychiatry. The broad area of biocommunications can be further subdivided into two general classifications: bioinformation and bioenergetics. Bioinformation includes paranormal events between living organisms, telepathy, precognition, and events between living organisms and the inorganic world. Bioenergetics denotes those activities such as biological location and indicator techniques, bioenergetic therapy using electromagnetic fields, and psychokinesis, or the influence of mind upon matter. It should be mentioned that parapsychology was accepted in 1969 as a legitimate field of science and scientific research by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Scientists in pre-revolutionary Russia were studying the area of parapsychology, as did later such Soviet scientists as V.M. Bekhterev, A.G. Ivanov-Smolensky, and B.B. Kaczynski in the 20s and 30s. In 1922, a commission composed of psychologists, medical hypnotists, physiologists, and physicists worked on parapsychology problems at the Institute for Brain Research in Petrograd. Work flourished throughout the 30s, with research being reported in the literature in 1934, 1936, and 1937. After 1937, further experiments in the field of parapsychology were forbidden. During Stalin's time, any attempt to study paranormal phenomena might have been interpreted as a deliberate attempt to undermine the doctrines of materialism. In 1964, the Aerospace Technology Division of the Library of Congress reviewed the Soviet literature in an unpublished bibliography entitled Soviet Parapsychology. At that time, academic opposition to parapsychology in the USSR had reached its zenith, which led observers to the reasonable conclusion that official Soviet support or funds for parapsychological research were unlikely, and that investigation in this area might be terminated. The above conclusion was apparently misguided because of events that occurred in 1959 and 1960. In 1959, a book entitled Mysterious Phenomena of the Human Psyche was published in the USSR. Its author was Professor L. Vasilev, head of the Department of Physiology of Leningrad University, and a corresponding member of the Academy of Medical Sciences of the USSR. A year later, Professor Vasilev was given state funds to establish, at the university, appropriately equipped laboratories for the study of telepathy. The published findings from this laboratory attracted attention and began to find repercussions in the columns of the non-specialized periodical press. This was followed by a publication in 1962 by Kaczynski. Following the example of Leningrad, other cities, including Moscow, Kiev, Novosibirsk, and Kharkov, established similar laboratories and research centers at which not only the phenomena described in world literature were examined, but a study was made of parapsychic features displayed by Soviet citizens. Section 2. Significance of parapsychology in the USSR. The Soviet Union is well aware of the benefits and applications of parapsychology research. In 1963, a Kremlin edict apparently gave top priority to biological research, which in Russia includes parapsychology. The major impetus behind the Soviet drive to harness the possible capabilities of telepathic communication, telekinetics, and bionics is said to come from the Soviet military and the KGB. Today it is reported that the USSR has 20 or more centers for the study of parapsychological phenomena, with an annual budget estimated in 1967 at over 12 million rubles, reported to be as high as $21 million. According to a report by Velinov, Soviet interest in biocommunications was clearly indicated in 1965, when the Department of Bioinformation of the Scientific and Technical Society of Radio Engineering and Telecommunications was established at the Popov Institute in Moscow. Its stated objectives are to discuss physical, biological, and philosophical aspects of bioinformation and to acquaint the Soviet scientific community with biocommunications research conducted outside the Soviet Union. Soviet parapsychology research was actually stimulated by the 1960 French story concerning the U.S. atomic submarine Nautilus. The French journalists splashed the now rather infamous Nautilus story in headlines, "U.S. Navy uses ESP on atomic sub. Ship-to-shore telepathy, according to the French, blipped along nicely even when the Nautilus was far underwater. Is telepathy a new secret weapon? Will ESP be a deciding factor in future warfare?" The speculating French sensationalized, "Has the American military learned the secret of mind power? In Leningrad, the Nautilus reports went off like a depth charge in the mind of L.L. Vasilev." In April of 1960, Dr. Vasilev, while addressing a group of top Soviet scientists, stated, "We carried out extensive and until now completely unreported investigations under the Stalin regime. Today, the American Navy is testing telepathy on their atomic submarines. Soviet scientists conducted a great many successful telepathy tests over a quarter of a century ago. It's urgent that we throw off our prejudices. We must again plunge into the exploration of this vital field." Although the U.S. Navy subsequently denied the reports of telepathic testing on atomic submarines, the Soviet hierarchy apparently heeded Dr. Vasilev's advice and gave support, both moral and financial, to his dynamic view that the discovery of the energy underlying telepathic communication will be equivalent to the discovery of atomic energy. Since 1962, Dr. Vasilev has headed a special laboratory for biocommunications research at the University of Leningrad. Major aspects of the work of this laboratory are to conduct research and to develop machines capable of monitoring, testing, and studying telepathic communication. In 1963, Dr. Vasilev claimed to have conducted successful long-distance telepathic experiments between Leningrad and Sevastopol, a distance of 1,200 miles, with the aid of an ultra-short-wave radio transmitter. As a result, Dr. Vasilev was convinced that his experiments offered scientific proof of telepathic communications. His next goal was to identify the nature of brain energy that produces it. Theorizing on the above experiments, one Soviet scientist suggested that telepathic impulses are radiated along the lines of bits of information in a cybernetic system. Another scientist is known to be working on the idea of time as energy, speculating that telepathic transmissions may be propagated through a supposed time-energy system, rather than through the electromagnetic field. Soviet research into biocommunications phenomena does not appear to be earthbound and limited to inner space, but apparently extends to outer space as well. The so-called father of Soviet rocketry, K.E. Tsiolkovsky, stated that, "In the coming era of space flights, telepathic abilities are necessary. It is precisely the solution of this secret which promises the greatest achievements." There are reports that the Soviets are training their cosmonauts in telepathy to back up their electronic equipment while in outer space. One of these backup schemes is known to involve coded telepathic messages. This method was previously demonstrated in March 1967, when a coded telepathic message was flashed from Moscow to Leningrad. The involvement of astronauts or cosmonauts in telepathy experiments is not necessarily unprecedented. In February 1971, during the Apollo 14 flight to the Moon, astronaut Edgar Mitchell made 150 separate attempts to project his thoughts from inside the space capsule back to an individual on Earth. There are numerous reports on Soviet applications of clairvoyance, hypnotism, dowsing, and so on in military operations. In the case of dowsing, this is also not unprecedented, since U.S. forces have employed dowsing in Vietnam for locating enemy tunnels and caches. With respect to brain and mind control conditioning, a recent report indicates that the Soviet Union has made great strides in emotional training and conditioning. Soldiers are being taught to set their own emotional tone in battle and stress situations. Further, astronauts are being taught through such mental conditioning to distort time and to offset boredom in outer space. Man's sight and hearing are limited to a relatively small range of wavelengths. Other living beings often possess much wider perceptive capabilities, both with regard to sharpness of perception and range of stimuli. Certain military advantages would come from the application and control of these perceptive processes. For example, such application and control could be used in the detection and identification of animate objects or humans through brainwave interactions, mass hypnosis or mind control through long-distance telepathy, thermal receptors, and sensitivity to changes in magnetic, electrical, or gravitational fields. According to observations made by Dr. Montague Ullman during a trip to the Soviet bloc countries in the fall of 1970, Soviet biocommunications investigations are effectively combining the use of modern and sophisticated technology with basic pragmatic approaches. This was evident, he states, in their approach to long-distance telepathy experiments, where the results were analyzed in physiological as well as psychological task performance. Dr. Ullman further observed that the Soviet researchers seemed intent on confirming the existence of a new form of energy, referred to as bioplasma, which they maintain is characteristic of life processes and represents matter in the form of an integrated system of elementary charged particles. Such energy, through interaction with other systems, is thought to provide the basis for biocommunications. The above commentary documents a clear case for research in the Soviet Union in parapsychology. It is significant because of the energy and resources being allotted for this work in the Soviet Union, and because of its military implications, especially in mind manipulation and controlled offensive behavior. The more sinister aspects of paranormal research appear to be surfacing in the Soviet Union. Why else would Soviet researchers make the statement, "Tell America that the psychic potential of man must be used for good"? Section 3. The apport technique. The following discussion on apports and astral projection is not intended to be an endorsement for its scientific verification or even its existence. However, reputable scientists in the USSR and the US are keenly interested in this phenomenon. Areas that appear to have potential must be discussed, even if only briefly. According to Welk, a costly weakness in our intelligence system, to a large extent, is an inability to use effectively the resources of the science of parapsychology. Whenever parapsychology is mentioned, most people are likely to think of ESP. However, there are other types of parapsychological phenomena which are just as important militarily as ESP. Welk claims, based on many Soviet sources, that the so-called apport technique is likely to meet valuable intelligence needs. When fully developed, this technique would make possible the abduction of actual objects, including documents, in enemy territory, and their transfer to friendly territory. Objects 3 so abducted are known as apports. They could be returned to the point of origin without the enemy becoming aware of this temporary abduction. Some of the world's most eminent scientists from the late 1800s and early 1900s have claimed to have witnessed apport phenomena. These include Sir William Crookes, British chemist and physicist, Alfred Russel Wallace, British naturalist and co-discoverer with Charles Darwin of the theory of evolution, and Johann K. F. Zöllner, professor of physical astronomy at the University of Leipzig, Germany. In the discussion of such an esoteric subject as apports, it is deemed sufficient to relate only one experience claimed to have occurred to Sir William Crookes. The following account is taken from his research. The appearance of hands, either self-luminous or visible by ordinary light. I will here give no instances in which the phenomenon has occurred in darkness, but will simply select a few of the numerous instances in which I have seen the hands in the light. I have more than once seen, first an object move, then a luminous cloud appear to form about it, and lastly, the cloud condense into shape and become a perfectly formed hand. It is not always a mere form, but sometimes appears perfectly lifelike and graceful, the fingers moving and the flesh apparently as human as that of any in the room. At the wrist or arm, it becomes hazy and fades off into a luminous cloud. To the touch, the hand sometimes appears icy cold and dead, at other times warm and lifelike, grasping my own with the firm pressure of an old friend. I have retained one of these hands in my own, firmly resolved not to let it escape. There was no struggle or effort made to get loose, but it gradually seemed to resolve itself into vapor and faded in that manner from my grasp. It is a known fact that the Soviet Union takes the appearance of luminous bodies very seriously, as evidenced by the Kirlian photography of the human body's aura. It appears that the Soviets may be considering that a hand which appears out of nowhere and can grasp another person may have first-rate military possibilities. There has been some discussion recently about the prospects of being able to control the apport technique to a point of sophistication where individuals could control these luminous clouds. The individuals who have studied these effects have suggested that since these bodies can travel unlimited distances and are able to pass through solid material like walls, they might well be used to produce instant death in military and civilian officials. It is further conjectured that these bodies could disable military equipment or communication nets. If one reads the cases and experiments mentioned here, he can make certain deductions. If any of this highly questionable material is true, then it can be inferred that organic matter can be transformed into ectoplasm, that this can be rendered invisible and impalpable, and thus converted into something which amounts to force. If organic matter can be converted into such force matter, it seems reasonable to assume that a physical object, if similarly converted, could travel through space. Two things are certain: that parapsychological phenomena are due to the little-known faculties of the subconscious mind, and that the powers of the subconscious mind are vastly superior to those of the normal consciousness. The fantastic memory of the subconscious mind, sometimes referred to as photographic memory, is a well-established fact. So is its extraordinary mathematical ability, which has baffled trained mathematicians no end. It seems probable that some of these little understood faculties of the subconscious mind have something to do with its ability to put together again an object which it had previously disintegrated, and to manipulate the forces involved in this process. The only way one can learn more about these little understood processes is through intensive study and experimentation. The stakes seem high enough. While the process by which matter is converted into force matter and vice versa may not be understood, nevertheless, one is faced with the possibility that the human mind can disintegrate and reintegrate organic matter, a feat which seems far more complex than the disintegration and reintegration of, say, a stone or a piece of paper. According to Pullman, director of the Southeast Hypnosis Research Center in Dallas, Texas, before the end of the 1970s, Soviet diplomats will be able to sit in their foreign embassies and use ESP, in this case a form of the apport technique, to steal the secrets of their enemies. Pullman states that a spy would be hypnotized, then his invisible spirit would be ordered to leave his body,
travel across barriers of space and time to a foreign government's security facility, and there read top-secret documents and relay back their information. Such astral projection already has been accomplished in laboratory settings, Pullman said, adding that the Russians are probably now trying to perfect it. Pullman further states that the Soviets are at least 25 years ahead of the U.S. in psychic research. According to Pullman, the Soviets have realized the immense military advantage of the psychic ability known as astral projection, or out-of-the-body travel. Sybil Leek, noted astrologer and author, states, "There is great danger that within the next 10 years, the Soviets will be able to steal our top secrets by using out-of-the-body spies."
Section 4. ESP and Psychokinesis. The reader by this time has realized that it is very difficult to speak of one area of psychic phenomenon without overlapping into other areas. There really can be no distinct separation, for example, between apports and certain aspects of telepathy. Hypnosis also enters into this area. In an attempt to illustrate the various subjects in parapsychology, however, artificial sections were established. Soviet research in ESP was started in the 1920s at Leningrad University by V.M. Bekhterev. In his early work, Bekhterev collaborated with V.L. Durov to investigate the effects of mental suggestion on a group of performing dogs. It was believed that telepathic communication depended on electromagnetic radiation. Dr. L.L. Vasilev, shown in a photograph as a pioneer Soviet parapsychologist at the Bekhterev Brain Institute, set out to identify these electromagnetic waves that carry telepathy. By 1937, Vasilev had amassed evidence that known electromagnetic waves do not carry telepathy. Tests were conducted in electrically shielded chambers and over extreme distances, denying the passage of electromagnetic fields. Professor L. Vasilev died in late 1965 or early 1966, and the task of continuing telepathy research was taken by Dr. I. Kogan. Dr. Kogan is chairman of the Bioinformation section of the Popov Radio and Technical Institute in Moscow. This individual is still trying to wed telepathy to the electromagnetic spectrum. For the sake of research, the Soviet Union accepts the validity of ESP, even though the argument as to the mode of transmission continues. A photograph of Professor E.K. Naumov shows him on the far right with sender Y. Kamenshi, a Soviet physicist, and receiver K. Nikolaev, a Soviet actor, during long-range telepathy tests. In 1967, the Soviet Maritime News reported, "Cosmonauts, when in orbit, seem to be able to communicate telepathically more easily with each other than with people on Earth." A PSI training system has been incorporated in the cosmonaut training program, but the news provided no further details. Some informal reports relayed to researchers indicate that the Soviets are working on PSI systems for space use, involving not just telepathy, but also precognition. Kogan's systematic parapsychology research could also be of potential value to the overall Soviet cybernetic research and development program. Efforts being made to optimize sensory inputs in the interest of controlling the quality of human motor activity are well known, as is the ultimate Soviet goal of achieving a perfect cybernetic man. It is of interest that both conventional psychology and parapsychology programs are headquartered in Moscow, which is probably no coincidence, and supports the view that the latter program should not be taken lightly. As mentioned above, the Soviets seem preoccupied with the search for the energy that carries or facilitates telepathy transmission. Is it electromagnetic or not? The search for this unknown energy has led the Soviets to Kirlian photography, named after its inventors Semyon and Valentina Kirlian. The Kirlians developed a technique of photographing with a high-frequency electrical field. Their first photographs showed turquoise and reddish-yellow patterns of flares coming out of specific channels within leaves. A magnified picture of a finger showed craters of light and flares. By the 1960s, research on bioluminescence revealed by Kirlian photography was going on in many Soviet universities. Perfected techniques of photographing the play of high-frequency currents on humans, plants, and animals, as well as on inanimate matter, have set the Soviets on some striking discoveries about the energetical nature of man. Bioplasma is a T4 term coined by the Soviets for this bioluminescent phenomenon or energy. Scientists at the Kazakh State University have found that illnesses tend to show up in advance as a disordered play of flares from the bioplasma long before they manifest in the physical body. According to researchers Ostrander and Schroeder, the Soviets may be attempting to link Kirlian photography with computers to instantly analyze the spectra of colors appearing in the vari-colored flares from the living body. It is believed that if there is any positive basis for Kirlian photography and the bioplasma body of humans, the Soviets may be closer than is thought on the controlled use of the apport techniques and possible astral projection phenomenon. Dr. A. Podshibyakin, an electrophysiologist in Kiev, has found that by charting acupuncture points, a correlation exists between the bioplasma and changes on the surface of the sun. At the exact moment solar flares occur, there are changes in the electrical potential of the skin's acupuncture points. In some way, the bioplasma of the body is sensitive to these solar explosions the instant they occur, even though it takes about 2 days for the cosmic particles to reach the Earth. The most significant use of Kirlian photography is in the area of psychokinesis, or mind over matter. Dr. Gennady Sergeyev of the A.A. Ukhtomsky Military Institute in Leningrad believes Kirlian photography may uncover the mechanism of PK. Sergeyev is a prominent mathematician for the Soviet military who works closely with an electrophysiologist from the University of Leningrad, Dr. L. Pavlova. Sergeyev has devised important mathematical and statistical methods for analyzing the EEG, which allowed parapsychologists to follow and depict the actions of telepathy in the brain. The type of work reported by Sergeyev in 1967 and 1968 is just now beginning to appear in the US. Sergeyev has conducted several years of intensive lab research on the outstanding PK psychic in Leningrad, Nina Kulagina. A photograph shows Dr. G. Sergeyev with an assistant, and another shows Mrs. Kulagina. Sergeyev registered heightened biological luminescence radiating from Kulagina's eyes during the apparent movement of objects by PK. Sergeyev postulates that the bioplasma of the human body must interact with the environment to produce PK. Sergeyev emphasizes when target objects are placed in a vacuum, Kulagina is unable to move them. Reportedly, Kulagina has caused the movement of a wide range of non-magnetic objects under strict scientific control, including large crystal bowls, clock pendulums, bread, and matches. In one test, a raw egg was placed in a salt solution inside a sealed aquarium 6 feet away from her. Researchers report she was able to use PK to separate the yolk from the white of the egg. Observations by Western scientists of Mrs. Kulagina's PK ability has been reported with verification of her authentic ability. These same Western scientists have reported that as of February 1971, they have not been able to visit or observe Mrs. Kulagina. A veil of secrecy has been placed on Sergeyev and Mrs. Kulagina for unknown reasons. Rather than simply observing PK, the Soviets typically turned to instrumentation. Mrs. Kulagina was subjected to a number of physiological electronic measuring devices and tested for important body functions during her PK demonstrations. The Soviets found that at the moment an object begins to move, all of Mrs. Kulagina's body processes speed up drastically. Heart, breathing, brain activity, and the electromagnetic fields around her body all begin to pulse in rhythm. Soviet researchers postulate that it was these rhythmic vibrations that cause objects to be attracted or repelled to her. A photographic sequence shows Kulagina moving a metallic cigar tube by PK. Scientists report that Kulagina has been able to stop the beating of a frog's heart in solution and to reactivate it. This is perhaps the most significant PK test done, and its military implications in controlled offensive behavior, if true, are extremely important. Space does not permit a discussion on other important parapsychological phenomena, such as eyeless sight, which appeared to be more of a fad than anything else. However, since the mid-1960s, the eyeless sight fad has subsided, and serious research has proceeded quietly at the State Pedagogical Institute in Sverdlovsk, off bounds to foreigners. Space in this report does not permit a discussion of psychotronic generators, devices which are reported to be able to store human bioplasmic forces for later use. Section 5. Summary and military implications. The following discussion is based on a report by Ostrander and Schroeder. The authors ask the question, is ESP a weapon of war? All research on ESP in the USSR is funded by the government. The authors claim that their sources indicate that PSI research with military potential is well financed by the Soviet Army, KGB, and other paramilitary agencies. Soviet scientists doing PSI research in non-military areas often have trouble obtaining funds. Dr. Milan Reisel reports that secret PSI research associated with state security and defense is going on in the USSR. Communist state authorities, the military and the KGB, display an unusual, disproportionate interest in parapsychology. The Soviets are attempting to apply ESP to both police and military use. According to Reisel, some years ago a project was begun in the USSR to apply telepathy to indoctrinate and re-educate antisocial elements. It was hoped that suggestion at a distance could induce individuals, without their being aware of it, to adopt the officially desired political and social attitudes. Reports of PSI research in Soviet submarines help confirm military involvement in parapsychology. According to Stone, there is clandestine PSI research going on at the Pavlov Institute of Higher Nervous Activity in Moscow, the Durov Institute, and certain areas in Siberia. Obviously, telepathy and clairvoyance would make ideal additions to a spy arsenal, and such undercover groups are constantly said to be supporting ESP research in the USSR. One conclusion seems justified, says Dr. Reisel. Parapsychology in communist countries, and especially the USSR, occupies a strong position. We can expect it to be developed with determination. According to Ostrander and Schroeder, the USSR is ahead of the US in certain areas of technical PSI research. The authors report that the USSR is ahead of the US in discoveries about the physical essence of the human being and how psi functions in and through us. They are ahead of the US in uncovering the basic energy behind psi. They are ahead of the US in attempts to control factors like the influence of magnetic weather on PSI tests. They appear to be ahead of the US in seeking out and creating conditions that unlock the PSI potential present in every human being. In summary, what is the strategic threat posed by the current explosion in Soviet parapsychological research? Soviet efforts in the field of PSI research, sooner or later, might enable them to do some of the following. A. Know the contents of top-secret US documents, the movements of our troops and ships, and the location and nature of our military installations. B. Mold the thoughts of key US military and civilian leaders at a distance. C. Cause the instant death of any US official at a distance. D. Disable, at a distance, US military equipment of all types, including spacecraft. It is generally conceded that the above four areas sound like science fiction. However, the literature appears to support item B as being the most possible use of PSI phenomena during the time frame of this study. Again from Ostrander and Schroeder, who cite Oliver Caldwell, an expert on Soviet affairs and past acting commissioner for international education in HEW, as follows. I am amazed at the skepticism and sometimes hostility which I encounter when I try to tell Americans about some of the experimentation which is taking place in the USSR in parapsychology and related fields. I find this strange because there is available documentation in translation which substantiates most of the things I saw in the USSR. I am really disturbed because if the United States does not make a serious effort to move forward on this new frontier, in another 10 years, it may be too late. In closing this section on parapsychology, a quote from astronaut Edgar D. Mitchell, Jr. is appropriate. Extrasensory perception is not a matter of belief. There is a great deal of serious scientific work being done in it, and it has been established over the last 30 years that it is a matter of probability, and the probabilities have been established beyond chance. I think it is an important work. I happen to be curious about it, and thus have been pursuing it for many years. This happened to be an opportunity, Apollo 14 lunar mission, to do another little step, a piece in the scientific puzzle of what man's all about.